Welcome to Hebrew Bible Insights, a podcast about making sense of the Hebrew Bible. Today we have a special guest with us, Edward Cook, and he's here to talk about what I would call the forgotten biblical language. That's right. There's more than just Hebrew and Greek. There's Aramaic. And he published a great book here, Biblical Aramaic and Related Dialects, an introduction. So we're going to have a wonderful time talking today, and we have a variety of questions. We have topics we're going to cover that are great for people who have no knowledge of Aramaic. And toward the end, we're going to get into some really advanced stuff. We're even going to break down an Aramaic text. So I think this will have something for everybody. So Ed, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me. Glad to be here and talk to you guys.
So before we dive into your material, in case someone's not familiar with you, can you give us a little introduction to yourself, and then maybe also a tidbit on when did you first get introduced to Aramaic, and when did you have that spark of interest?
Okay. I'm Edward Cook. I'm a professor in Semitic languages at Catholic University of America. I've been here since 2008. But how I got interested in this is years ago, many years ago, right before the flood and antediluvian times, I showed up on the campus of Fuller Seminary with some kind of vague plan of going into ministry. And this was the mid-'70s. So at that time, at Fuller, they had a big-time, heavy-duty language program going on. So the first quarter of the first year, you wouldn't take 3 or 4 classes. You took one class, and that was Greek. And you would be in Greek class 5 days a week, 4 hours a day. And the days you weren't in class, you were getting ready for the next day. So it was a really heavy duty introduction to Greek. And then the following year, the same was with Hebrew, right? So 5 days a week, 4 hours a day. And it was all by the inductive method. The Hebrew class taught by William Sanford Lasore. You just dive in day one in the book of Esther, right? Vayehi, this is a vav, right? This is a yod. And a lot of people, it was pretty challenging for a lot of people, but I ate it up, and I really enjoyed it. And so whatever ideas I had about whatever vague ideas I had about ministry were substituted by the desire to study the languages. And then Aramaic came along. And I had actually gotten interested in Aramaic in college. I had a friend who was of they call themselves Assyrians, right? The Assyrian ethnic group, which is a Middle Eastern ethnic group that speaks Aramaic as a native language. They speak Neo-Aramaic. And so my friend was a native speaker of Aramaic and used to talk about it being the language of Jesus. And I had that idea in my head for a long time that this was a really interesting, romantic thing to study once I got done with Hebrew and Greek. So when Fred Bush offered the introductory Aramaic class at Fuller, I signed right up for that. Aramaic was not obligatory at that time, so you had to be really serious Semitics guy to take Aramaic. So, but I did, and that's how I got interested in those topics.
Well, we love it, having a serious Semitic guy. You're speaking our language, pun intended.
Right.
So you studied with William Sanford Lasore?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic! We have his collection in our his library collection in our.
Oh, is that right?
In our library here, yeah. I was doing some cataloging this summer with it, and I just loved it. I was going through all the texts that were there, thinking, "Oh, it's just wonderful."
Yeah.
So
no, he was a terrific teacher and a real polymath in the sense that he knew tons about tons, right? Especially about languages. So.
Amazing.
Yeah,
what an honor.
That was a privilege.
What or how do you express why Aramaic is important for people who are interested in the Bible, especially the Hebrew Bible? How would you go about expressing that?
Well, there's a lot to say about that, actually. So as Matthew pointed out at the beginning, there is some Aramaic in the Hebrew Bible, right? So parts of Daniel and Ezra and a verse in Jeremiah are all in Aramaic. So if you're a completist, right, you want to add Aramaic to your knowledge of the biblical languages. So it is a biblical language, but it's not just the canonical parts, which is actually a pretty small part of the Bible, like 1% maybe of the Hebrew Bible is in Aramaic. But even the Hebrew parts of it are connected with Aramaic in a lot of interesting ways. In the pre-exilic material during the time of the monarchy, you can read about how the kingdoms of Judah and Israel fought against the Arameans. They were in contact with them, and Aramaic words pop up in those books. And then after the exile, they went into in Judah, they went into exile in 586 BC, and then they came out 538 BC, and whoa, everybody's speaking Aramaic. So, everyone in the Near East is speaking Aramaic. So they adopted Aramaic alongside Hebrew. And Aramaic influenced late biblical Hebrew of the biblical books. Going on is the New Testament, right? There's a lot of Aramaic in the background there. If you're studying the New Testament, Aramaic influence, Semitic influence is on the different pages of New Testament Greek. Text critically, there are Aramaic documents, the Targums and the Peshitta. If you want to do serious work in Old Testament text criticism, you have to be able to work with those documents. Mm-hmm. Some of the Dead Sea Scrolls are in Aramaic. Some of the most interesting ones, in my opinion, are in Aramaic. All the Jewish interpretive literature, the Targums, which is a great introduction for Christians into Jewish modes of interpretation, would be the Targums, Aramaic translations of the Old Testament. Also the Masoretic notes, all the little notes in the margin of the BHS that no one actually looks at. They are in Aramaic, right? They're all abbreviations and things, but they're abbreviations of Aramaic words. So you have to really know Aramaic. So every page, literally, of the BHS has Aramaic on it. So, Syriac, Eastern Christianity, if you want to get into patristics, the late antiquity, Syriac and Aramaic dialect is of major importance. So, if you're interested in biblical studies at all, you turn any corner in biblical studies and you're going to get mugged by Aramaic. It's right there. It's just it pops up at every moment. So it's always there in the background. It's like the guy that everybody knows who's very influential, and to get anywhere you have to know that guy. Right? So Aramaic is that guy.
Very good.
Well, you've convinced us. We repent of our ignorance and our non-use of Aramaic. No, I kid, but that's a great introduction, and you've also situated it culturally and historically. The people groups of the ancient Near East, everything from the Arameans to everyone else who used the language. Also, great point about the Masoretic text. I mean, it's the base text we use, and I even think about that's another great example. If we're really going to engage fully with the Masoretic text, you also need to know Aramaic. So you're talking, you're talking from the Leningrad Codex all the way back to skirmishes with the Arameans. You're talking 2,000 years of history just right there. Right. Exactly. So that's a lot. You alluded to some fun texts we'll get to later. But a question I want to ask you is, I think, again, kind of leveraging how more people are probably more familiar with Hebrew literature, Hebrew language, and obviously you've done a lot of Hebrew as well. Are there any general differences that you feel when you're engaging with Hebrew literature versus Aramaic literature? I know that's a big corpus. Obviously, you could take this any direction you want to. But is there anything that you notice on maybe a big picture scale when you read Hebrew and Aramaic literature?
Well, I'm not sure if you're asking about the grammar, what it feels like to read Aramaic, or just the kinds of genre that there
Sure,
are.
either actually. Yeah, if you want to do language or literature, either way.
Yeah. So, I mean, the further back you go, the more the genres of Aramaic are like Old Testament genres. So unfortunately, we don't have a particular religious group like the Jews to preserve a lot of Aramaic stuff as their holy book. So we have to kind of rely on archaeological serendipity and the accidents of survival for our knowledge of Aramaic genres. But the royal inscriptions of the oldest period of Old Aramaic are very much reminders. It would remind us a lot of some of the historical books. The Sephire Treaty inscribed on the 3 basalt stelae, right in line with the treaty covenant notions that you find in the Old Testament. So, as you go forward, the Hebrew literature comes to be more like Aramaic literature, actually. So you get the interpretive literature of later periods of the rabbinic period are written in Hebrew and in Aramaic, and even what I call Middle Hebrew or Rabbinic Hebrew is very much indebted to Aramaic. So the feel of it as you go forward it feels the same, right? And within Judaism and the Hebrew and Aramaic were co-conspirators, right? They traveled together as sister languages throughout the history of Judaism. And if you read one, you're going to wind up reading the other, So, and tons of Hebrew words, even in modern Hebrew, are derived from Aramaic. A lot of times the Academy of Hebrew Language, if they're stuck for a word, right? I mean, they're always creating words that are native. If they get stuck, then they will often turn to Aramaic. So for etymology, like I noticed, I was in Jerusalem this past summer, and I forget where I saw it, but it was in a store somewhere. There was a picture of an octopus, and octopus is tamanun, right? Timane is Aramaic for 8. So they don't use anything with shmone, right, which is 8 in Hebrew. They'd go to Aramaic for their word.
Well, that's really cool.
Yeah. So, I mean, like I say, it's all over the place. It's going to rise up and smite you at any moment.
Well, I wonder if we shouldn't jump in to maybe tell us that you could tell us a little bit about the layout of your book. Matthew had alluded to the inductive and the deductive methods that you use within the learning philosophy of language learning philosophy that you have in this book. Maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, there's 2 ways or 2 principal ways of acquiring a language. One is passive, where you kind of learn to read it and recognize forms and so forth. Then there's active, where you're able to speak it, produce sentences in that language. And everyone agrees that an active knowledge is better than a passive knowledge. Even if it's of a dialect that's only partially related. Like it's good to know modern Hebrew. Good to be able to speak, as you guys know, it's good to be able to speak modern Hebrew. Helps you immeasurably with your biblical Hebrew. If you know modern Greek, it helps tremendously with New Testament Greek or with the Septuagint or whatever. But there's not any corresponding language to acquire actively for Aramaic. I mean, there is modern Aramaic, but it's very, very different from the ancient dialects. So you're kind of confined to passive knowledge, gaining or reading a knowledge of that. But one way to compensate for the lack of active strategies is to read inductively as much as possible, right? So you acquire language by exposure to it, by constant exposure to it. So that's what I've tried to do a little bit of in this grammar. So the first part is a research grammar, basically, that anyone could use, hopefully, for their understanding of Aramaic. But then the last part, the last chapter, is a reading guide that just dives right into the text of Daniel. And so if you've acquired a little bit of general knowledge from skimming or looking at the research grammar, then you can start in seeing the actual phenomena. I find that the more people are exposed to the actual phenomena of the language, the quicker they learn it, the more fun it is, right? So,
right.
You're not asking how to order a sandwich in Aramaic. And that's the reason people are learning Aramaic, is because they want to read these texts. Like,
right.
Okay, well, let's just read them, and we'll learn it as we go along. And that seems to work well. So a few years ago, I did have the idea to experiment with active learning of Aramaic. So, we tried to have Aramaic conversations, and I translated, I've got the joy down in my heart into Aramaic so that we can.
That's amazing.
That's great.
But it didn't really work that well because we wanted to pivot to reading text. There wasn't it just didn't work as well as I thought it would. So, but passive knowledge, but inductive exposure is the best way, I think, to acquire these languages.
Very good.
Yeah, this type of learning speaks directly to me and what I'm passionate about, because like you said, as a learner, I want to engage directly with the text. And
right.
I think there's a different approach that some take where it's really heavy on deductive grammar. And I think I understand a little bit where they're coming from, because they feel an immense responsibility to make sure that that we aren't making egregious errors, especially when people are going to be preaching about these things or doing academic research about these topics. They don't want anyone to make some mistakes with that. But the problem I found is if you have to go a long time without reading and engaging with text, then the passion can wane, things can feel a little boring. And also, I think it's hard to understand because grammatical concepts make more sense when we're actually reading a specific story.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I love the layout, and you make an important note there at the beginning. Hey, you recommend go to that last chapter and just read a line, or you have your Aramaic text laid out,
right.
And I think you start with Daniel and you have one verse. And once people have learned how to read the alphabet and the phonetics of it, you list all of the grammatical sections in your book and what page they're on, so they can flip back to it to understand what's going on. And
right.
So anyway, I love how you dive straight into the primary text of Aramaic. I think it creates it's a much more fun experience, much more meaningful experience, knowing from the beginning, I am getting to actually read something written a long time ago.
Right.
So
right. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Yeah. That's the aim, and and not just primary, but as much as possible, right? Because the things that are important are going to come up again and again.
Yeah.
Right. If you if you read a word that's rare and you forget it, it's not a big loss. But a word that's important will be used again and again, and eventually you're going to get it. You're not going to have to look it up every single time. So I like to read inductively. I like to read a lot.
That's great.
That's my philosophy of language learning.
How much did studying with Lesor impact the way that you approach teaching a language, writing this book? Can you maybe speak to that?
Yeah, I would say a lot. Part of Lesor's method worked at Fuller because, as I say, they at that time, at least, they committed to a huge amount of time to do that. And it works best if you can give it a lot of time. So I don't know anyone who does quite that much. Demanding language study up front. but certainly the inductive method, I was sold on that early on. And, I know from experience now that not everyone cottons to it. You have to, some people just because you have to endure, at first you have to endure this feeling that you're lost. Like, I have no idea what's going on. What is going on here? I need it all to come together. But if if you're patient, if you give it time, keep following the method, there'll come a point when it'll all come together. Like, oh man, I'm flying. I was running before and flapping my arms, but now I'm actually flying. So I think it does work. So it's one method, I think, among many that can work. So so I hope it's.
So let me ask you a question now about the other distinctive, because really the two main things I loved about your book. The first one was how you have the heavy reading approach, but also having the reference grammar, so at any point you can go into a grammatical concept. The other part I liked is, again, it's in the title of your book, Biblical Aramaic and Related Dialects. You mentioned before, Biblical Aramaic, if you want to be a completionist, read the whole Bible, then you need to do Aramaic. But there is a truth to this, that it's a very small corpus, and it can be difficult to grasp all the language. But I think a lot of Aramaic teaching is really emphasized on, we're just trying to get the Bible, so that we're only going to give you the verses from Scripture and then move on. But the problem is it's harder to get a more holistic, big picture understanding of the language because it's a limited. Yeah. So what you do is you actually put in other Aramaic texts. And the strategy you chose even within this is interesting to me, because I find many will go more to the later text, but you go to a lot of contemporary. Can you go ahead and dive into, why did you decide to include extra biblical Aramaic texts? What's the importance of using them, and how did you go about choosing which ones?
Well, it kind of follows from the inductive method. If you're going to read a lot of texts, you have to have a lot of text. And we don't have a lot of biblical Aramaic text. So we have the chapters 2 through 7 of Daniel, and 2 or 3 chapters in Ezra, and that's it. It's about 1% of the Bible, and you can treat that. I mean, there are grammars out there that treat just those sections, just biblical Aramaic, but it winds up, in my opinion, those grammars wind up being kind of a commentary on Daniel and Ezra, and that's it. If you want to actually learn the language, you have to be exposed to it. You have to be exposed to more of it than typically is present in biblical Aramaic. So I wanted there to be more, not just for the sake of biblical Aramaic, but in the hopes that people would get interested in the literature and the field itself of Aramaic and Semitics. And so there has to be more out there. And I had to choose texts that were credibly similar to biblical Aramaic, so that people wouldn't have to learn an entirely new dialect. So, you can't, Syriac and biblical Aramaic are both Aramaic dialects, but they're different enough that you couldn't have them in the same grammar. But Imperial Aramaic of the Persian period is, allowing for differences in orthography, has a lot of similarities to biblical Aramaic. And then the Aramaic of the Dead Sea Scrolls, even more so. There's, I don't think people, except for the fact that there's no vowel points or any of the Masoretic trappings. If you move from biblical Aramaic to Qumran Aramaic, I think most people are probably not aware of a huge difference, that this is the same dialect. Of course, you also have to teach people to read without vowel points, so that's another hurdle, right?
Yeah.
So, so for the inductive method to work, you have to have lots of text, but the texts all have to be of at least similar dialects. So that's why I picked the dialects that I did. Originally, I was going to put some Targum stuff in there, but that really was a bridge too far, and decided to stick with just the Imperial and Qumran material.
And of those extra sources, which would you say is your favorite as far as extra biblical Aramaic sources?
I started out my career as an Aramaist, as a Semitist, studying Targum, and so the Targums are particular interest, and I have affection for Targumic studies and for reading the Targum. And at Catholic, I originally started out. My method was, okay, we need a lot of Aramaic. There's a lot of Aramaic, the Targums. Let's just start with Targumic Aramaic. But people found that frustrating. I think especially people that wanted to get into the directly canonical Aramaic.
Yeah.
Were they had to wait for the second year for biblical Aramaic. So I switched it around and joined the standard way of introducing people to Aramaic through biblical Aramaic.
I love it.
So,
well, I guess it means. I guess it means you're just going to have to write another book for us. You're going to have to write part two.
I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we'll see. It could happen.
It's interesting thinking about where you started your career, as an Aramaist specializing in Targums, because I feel like in recent years, there's been another new resurgence of Targumic studies. I know, Nathan, you have a friend, a colleague who specializes in the Targums as well.
Yeah.
Astara, someone who I studied with, was doing some work with looking at Targum manuscripts. So it's kind of interesting, just seeing, the Targums, although for some people they view it as just a non-canonical, to periphery, but there's a lot of interest there. And, I wasn't planning on asking you this, but I wondered, can you just speak a little bit to the value of the Targums in your mind? Obviously, it's been a major area of interest for you throughout your career.
Well, right. There's lots of things that, if you're like me, you're interested in the languages. And so there's a lot of material there for both lexicographical and grammatical for understanding Aramaic. So, that interests me. But just in terms of the interpretive history of the Bible, I think it's an excellent way. I mentioned this before, for Christians to get into Jewish interpretive literature, right? So, it's a vast field. You've got Talmud, you've got Midrash, you've got all kinds of halakhic commentary, which is daunting, I think, for Christians. But the Targum is like, oh, this is a translation. I can read this. It's a translation with comments and paraphrases and interesting asides and digressions. I can understand those. So and I think those are, I think they're interesting to read. And the thing about the Targums is that they're not, like a lot of translations, they're not meant as a substitute for the Bible, right? So when the Septuagint was translated, it's like Greek-speaking Jews and Christians were like, okay, this is the Bible. When Jerome translated the Vulgate into Latin, it was like for 1,000 years the Vulgate was just the Bible. But the Targum never became the Bible for Jews. The Bible is always the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
But the Targum is always like a handy thing next to it. You can read it if you don't understand something. You can read the Targum if you want to know the implications of a certain verse for Jewish practice or theology. The Targum will have a paraphrase or an addition which explains that. So, and that makes it. I think that makes them really interesting. Of course, they've been leveraged by a lot of New Testament scholars as well for the interpretive material that's found there for New Testament studies. Not always convincingly, in my opinion, but it's still a growing field of New Testament scholars who are using Targum, which is all to the good.
Not to take us too far left field, but it's interesting you're talking about this, because just yesterday I was reading Genesis chapter 4, And I noticed there's an interesting verse, Genesis 4:26, that talks about the birth of Seth's kid, Enosh, and most English translations will say, and humanity began, and he began to call upon the name of the Lord. And it's a really interesting passage. A lot of people like to compare it to the Exodus passage of when did they start calling on the name of the Lord. But I looked into the Aramaic Targum as well as Septuagint, and MT, Targum, Septuagint all handle the word differently. Whereas in Hebrew, huchal, it's, they began, but that root can also mean to defile. And that's how Onkelos takes it, saying that then in his days, mankind was too defiled to pray in the name of the Lord. Wow. And Septuagint seems to read yachal as that word saying that humanity hoped to pray to the Lord. Yeah. So anyway,
it's a strange form, right? Huchal, it's a hofal of halal. So it's like it was begun to pray. I mean, it was it's kind of a strange, in the Jewish traditional literature, they say that a certain verse says dorsheni, right? Dorsheni, seek me, interpret me. There's certain forms that just call out for some kind of comment. So that's one of those verses that says dorsheni, right?
That's cool.
Explain me.
I love it.
Yeah.
So speaking of, getting into the niche of grammar, I wonder if you can just tell us, is there a specific, whether lexical or grammatical concept within Aramaic that you just find really interesting and that you would like to share with our audience, just to give us whether, yes, we have people who know Aramaic, but, we also hope we have people listening who they're wanting to get greater at Aramaic. Maybe give us a little taste.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things to me about Aramaic is that overall, it's a simpler language than Hebrew. I mean, most people, I would say that the vast majority of people coming to Biblical Aramaic, I've already had Hebrew, right? But Aramaic is simpler. So in the verbal system, you have prefix verbs, imperfects and suffix verbs, perfects. Hey, and that's it. You've got participles and you've got one infinitive. And you want to look on the back, like, is that it? There's this because in the biblical Hebrew, you've got this cockamamie system where you've got the perfect and the imperfect, and then apparently an entirely separate system where everything is reversed. And then you have participles and then two different kinds of infinitives. So you have this elaborate verbal system in Hebrew, which is not to be found in Aramaic, right? So that's interesting. That also says, explain me. But I think that's one of the interesting things about Aramaic is the verbal system is, by comparison to Hebrew, is stripped down and more. It's as they say, tense prominent and not aspect prominent. It's the more of a tense system, and then you have in Hebrew. So, you find the same thing in post-biblical Hebrew, in rabbinic Hebrew. You find that the same system in that brand of Hebrew that you find in Aramaic, because Aramaic has started to exercise a big influence on Hebrew at that point. So if you know modern Hebrew, you'll look at Aramaic and go, okay, this is I know this. This is the same. This is pretty much the same system that we have in modern Hebrew, because modern Hebrew is indebted to rabbinic Hebrew as far as the verbal system goes, and that is in turn more indebted to Aramaic than it is to biblical Hebrew.
Yeah, fascinating. One thing I really loved about your book, especially as I was telling you before we started recording, was the introduction and your emphasis on comparative Semitics. I really enjoyed that you were placing Aramaic within that. So I sort of have two questions for you. One, what role does comparative Semitics play for understanding the Aramaic language? I think that would be my first one. My second, of course, that Aramaic replaces Akkadian as the lingua franca of the Near East. And of course, because the Persians come to power. But even before that, we see that Aramaic's being used somewhat in that way between certain communities. So I wonder if you could maybe speak as to why go to Aramaic? Is it just because of the simplicity of the language compared to something like Akkadian, or maybe just talk a little bit about that transition, if you could?
Right. So taking the first question about comparative Semitics, I don't think you need to know comparative Semitics to know Aramaic or any other Semitic language really. But learning Aramaic is an excellent entree into comparative Semitics, right? I mean, by willy-nilly, you're comparing Semitic languages. If you've had some Hebrew and then you go into Aramaic, you're going to compare them, and you start realizing some things about the different languages. So, the negative in Aramaic is la, in Hebrew it's lo. You're like, oh, there's no Canaanite shift in Aramaic, right? They say shlam instead of shalom, same thing. And why shlam instead of shalom? Well, it's because the short vowels reduce in pre-tonic syllables instead of lengthen like they do. So, you have to notice these things. So it's for students in our department, who are going on to get doctorates in Semitic languages. This is, for most of them, this is their first introduction to the issues of comparative Semitic. So you don't have to know it to know Aramaic, but if you know Aramaic, it will lead you into comparative Semitics, I think. So, which is a good thing, right? So the second question was, why did Aramaic become the lingua franca, which is an excellent question. And I'm not sure that anybody really knows, because, at the beginning of the first millennium BCE, there were these Aramean kingdoms. At the same time that, Judah and Israel were monarchies in the southern Levant, and to the north, you had these Aramaic monarchies. And then at a certain point, they were taken over by the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians, and then the Persians. Usually when that happens, the language of the oppressed is, squashed or disappears or something. But the exact opposite happened with Aramaic. It kind of flourished during imperial times and became, as you say, the lingua franca. And no one is quite sure why that happened. It probably at some point, virally or rhizomatically, Aramaic just spread and became a common second language during this period, right? Not the first language. I mean, it's not like the Arameans were conquering everybody, but for some reason their language went out and was adopted. Maybe it had something to do with the writing system, right? The Arameans adopted the alphabet. So people were like, hey, instead of learning cuneiform, I could learn, the 22-letter alphabet. That's a lot easier. But it's not exactly clear. It's one of the mysteries. But probably the simplification of Aramaic came as a result of that widespread use, and not.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So a language that is widely acquired as a second language will tend to overall simplify. I mean, there's no such thing as a simple language, right? Right. But there can be, comparatively stripped down languages compared to other. English is a widespread second language, a lot easier, really, than the other Germanic languages. You don't have the case system, right?
Yeah.
So if you guys undoubtedly have to learn German as your part of your part of being a scholar is learning German, but English is, we don't have the cases, or we just have remnants of cases in English. So same kind of thing in Aramaic. It probably became stripped down for widespread use because of its widespread use.
Yeah, very
So
interesting.
That didn't really answer your question. But,
No, it's good though. Yeah, it's
yeah.
Yeah, there are definitely mysteries, things that we just
Yeah.
won't be able to figure out.
Right.
So one thing that I've been really looking forward to for this interview that I'm really excited about is I wonder if you can read a section of Aramaic. You choose whatever text you want. I think our listeners would love to get to just hear someone read something in the Aramaic language, give a little translation and some comments on what do you see. And
Okay, let me grab a Bible here. Hang on a second.
go ahead.
So I was going to, you prepared me for this question. So I thought a interesting verse to look at would be Jeremiah 10, verse 11.
Yeah,
which is the
nice.
only Aramaic verse in the prophets, right? So in the Pentateuch, you have one Aramaic phrase, one noun phrase. In the prophets, you have this one verse, and of course, in the writings, the third major section, you have Daniel and Ezra and all these. You have a lot more Aramaic. So. But right in the middle of Jeremiah 10, all of a sudden, you, like I say, you're mugged by Aramaic. If you're used to if you're reading along in Hebrew, all of a sudden in verse 11, you have this Aramaic verse right in the middle of Jeremiah's flow. In chapter 10, we have verse 11, which is in Aramaic. So. Kithna temrun lahom, thus you shall say to them, and it's you plural, thus y'all shall say to them, Elahaya dishmaya arka la'avadu, the gods who heaven and earth did not make, Yevadu me'ara u'mentachoth shmaya ela, let them perish from earth and from underneath these heavens. So kind of a pious wish that idolaters would perish, right? Or the gods that the idols would perish. But the fun thing about this is that the Aramaic is in perfect chiastic order, right? You've got Elahaya at the beginning, the gods, Elahaya, the gods. At the end, you have Ela, these. The same word as biblical Hebrew, Ela. And you have D, Shemaya. D is this all-purpose particle, kind of a jack of all trades, Swiss Army knife particle. Right here, it means it's a relative pronoun. The gods who, Elahaya, D. The gods who, Shemaya, heavens, the heavens, Arka, and the earth. So we actually have, interestingly, two different forms of the Aramaic word for earth in this. First one of them, archaic, Arka with a kof, and the second, Ar'a with an I, and they're both cognate to Hebrew eretz, by the way, which would lead us into phonological byways that we don't want to explore right now. The gods who heaven and earth, La, there's our La, did not make, La Avadu, did not make, Yevadu, let them perish, the adjusted form, let them perish. So Avadu and Yevadu are, right, that's the chiastic hinge, right? You've got A, B, C, D, and then D, Me'ara. So heaven and earth in the first part, and then earth and heaven in the second part. Me'ara, from let them perish from the earth. Omen tachoth shmaya, and from under the heavens, Ela, these, from under these heavens. So each constituent that pious wish is in chiastic concord with some other part of it. So I just think that, it's obviously not something you're ever going to notice except in looking at the original Aramaic.
Right.
That's beautiful.
It's kind of fun to see that.
Yeah. I think that's one of the one of the greatest things about reading a text in original language is the style. And I think for many people who are doing biblical, they're interested in the Bible, because they want to get insights that impact their personal faith. That's awesome, right? That's a big part of why I do what I do. But I think one of the things that's overlooked often is just the style of things. And in fact, many people are, right now as we're recording this, that we're early January, people are trying to get back into reading scripture. But one of the biggest hurdles for many people is just many sections feel boring. And I can relate to this. I was a kid growing up and I knew scripture mattered. I watched Bible Man. I don't know if you know who Bible Man is, just a Star Wars, a Christian Star Wars, basically, a guy with a lightsaber and a cape that quote Bible verses to beat bad guys. Yeah. But the challenge was that reading certain sections could feel boring. And I think there are a variety of reasons for that. But I remember starting to read the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew, everything felt so engaging. And the poetry was so moving and captivating. And so what you just did here for us is just a simple example of that, breaking down one line and the flow of that. It's captivating and draws you in as you read the text. Do you have any other thoughts, by the way, on this note that you might speak to on the personal value that you've gained from your deep study of Aramaic throughout your career? Obviously, there's the the professional side, but even just the personal that you've gained from that.
Well, at this point, I'm not sure if I can distinguish the professional and the personal.
Sure.
Right. So it's fulfilling to do this work, and I got started because I'm interested as a Christian in this in these texts, and I continue to be interested in them, and both personally and professionally. I'm not. It wouldn't be easy for me to distinguish those at this point. So, but what's interesting is you're saying, which I think everyone would agree with, that it's valuable and invaluable to read the text in the original language. What's interesting is it took a long time for people to come around to that idea. And I don't mean just recently, but in Christian history. I mean, there was a millennium where hardly anyone would look at the Hebrew of the Old Testament or the Greek of the New Testament. They had the Vulgate. And Jerome and St. Augustine had this famous debate on the value of it. And Jerome was like, you have to look at the Hebrew. Don't you want to know what the thing says? And Jerome was like, well, God was guiding the Septuagint authors, and the current Latin translation is a translation of that. So I'm good. So, and I think probably a lot of people in the pews are like, no, we've got the whatever it is that we're reading now, the NRSV, the NIV, the ESV, we're good. But yeah, just the vividness, the aliveness of it is, different orders of magnitude greater if you can look at the thing itself, or even just get a taste of it through word study or something like that.
That's good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for the work you've done throughout your career to help people be able to dig deep in this, because becoming a linguist, it is tough, long work. It is, I tell students that there are certain subjects that are really hard to fake, right? There's zero ability to fake a language. If you want to try to write an essay about a certain topic in history and you're like, well, wait, maybe I don't know. I think I remember this event happening. We try to connect things, but if you look at a page, if you don't know the letters, you don't know the grammar of the words, you can't fake it. And it takes a long time to master that. So thank you for all the work you've put in behind the scenes for so long, all the great publications you've done, and also writing this book, which we'll post links where people can get this book at in the show notes and description below. Sure. I'm really excited for this. Honestly, this is the textbook I wish I had learned Aramaic with. And if I end up teaching Aramaic, this is what I'm going to use. I love the layout. And I think it's very effective and also great for reference throughout your personal life or throughout your career, whatever you're doing. You can always go back, see what notes he has under certain verses or texts of Aramaic, or reference the grammar.
Right. Thank you.
Do either of you two have any last thoughts or comments as we close?
Well, I just want to second that. I think it's an excellent grammar. So thank you so much, Ed, for writing this. I'm happy to have it on my shelf. And it's going to be any scholars out there, anyone teaching Aramaic, this would be an excellent book to go to. So,
well, I thank you for those kind words. And, I'll just say to y'all and to the anyone listening, if you're interested in languages at all, Semitic or not, you'll never be bored. Right?
That's good.
There's always something going on with languages. So,
I guess the last thing I was going to ask real quickly is just if anyone wants to connect more with your content or you, maybe like where do you teach, or where's a good place to get your access to your books or maybe your articles?
Right. If there's an article of mine that you know of, just contact me at Catholic University of America. You can find me on the website. Just feel free to ask me and I'll send you a copy. So, which most scholars are happy to send a PDF or something of whatever article they've written. Don't go to a site and pay $35 for it or something like that. Just write to me and I'll send it to you. So I'm happy to answer any questions via email that anyone would like to
Fantastic.
ask.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining the show, and
thanks
have a great year.
All right.
Yeah,
thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.